The nanny slept on the floor with the baby. The millionaire saw it and fell in love with her. The storm outside rattled the windows of the sprawling mansion, each gust of wind howling like a warning from the heavens. Ethan Walsh, a man whose wealth was as legendary as his loneliness, walked quietly down the grand staircase, unable to sleep. The storm had unsettled him, though it wasn't the thunder that kept him awake. It was the silence of his home. A silence that had lingered since his wife's passing 3 years ago. Now, only the cries of his 6-month-old daughter, Grace, broke through the emptiness from time to time. She was the reason he had hired a nanny. A young woman named Clara Hayes. He barely knew her. She was polite, quiet, and professional. He told himself that was enough. As Ethan reached the nursery door that night, something made him pause. Grace wasn't crying. Instead, the faint sound of soft humming drifted through the door, like a lullaby he had almost forgotten. Curiosity tugged at him. He pushed the door open just enough to see inside. Clara wasn't asleep in the guest room prepared for her. She wasn't resting on the soft armchair in the corner of the nursery. Instead, she was lying on the hardwood floor, curled around the baby like a shield against the storm. Her hand rested gently on Grace's tiny chest, her breathing steady and calm, while the little girl slept peacefully in her arms. Ethan's throat tightened. He had seen countless women dressed in jewels and gowns at his galas, but never had he seen something so disarming, so quietly beautiful. She could have left the baby in the crib. She could have walked away when Grace woke crying. She could have sought her own comfort. But instead, she chose the floor. She chose to stay. And in that moment, Ethan saw her, not as an employee, but as a woman whose heart was richer than any fortune he had ever earned. The next morning, Clara woke with a stiff neck and a sore back. She hadn't meant to fall asleep there. She worried Ethan might think she was careless. But when she entered the kitchen, she was startled to find him already there, making coffee. He looked different somehow, softer, though his usual composure remained. "You were up late," he said quietly, sliding a mug toward her. Clara blinked, her cheeks warm. I didn't want Grace to be frightened by the storm." "She wasn't," Ethan replied. His gaze lingered on her, not with scrutiny but something else. Something gentler. For a man used to signing million-dollar deals and making split-second decisions, Ethan suddenly found himself hesitating. He wanted to say more, to thank her, to tell her what he had seen. But the words lodged in his throat, so instead, he simply said, "You did well." And that was the beginning. Over the weeks that followed, Ethan began noticing things he had overlooked before. How Clara always bent to Grace's level when speaking to her, as if every sound the baby made mattered. How she carried herself with quiet dignity, even though her shoes were worn at the heels and her bag looked older than her. How she never ate until after Grace was settled, prioritizing the baby's needs above her own. One afternoon, as Ethan returned early from a meeting, he found Clara outside in the garden. Grace was in her stroller, giggling as Clara made faces at her, pretending to be a clumsy bird hopping around the flower beds. The millionaire, who had built empires and bought skyscrapers, stood hidden behind a window, watching two souls who had no idea he was there. For the first time in years, he smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile he wore at business dinners, but the kind that came from somewhere deep inside. That evening, during dinner, he asked her a question he had never asked before. "Clara, why did you choose this job?" She looked surprised. She set down her fork. "Honestly, because it mattered. I've worked in offices and cafes, but none of it felt real. Children, they're real. They don't care about money or status. They just need love. And I thought maybe I could give a little of that." Her words struck him like a chord he hadn't heard in years. One night, weeks later, Grace fell ill with a fever. Panic swelled in Ethan's chest as he held his daughter, her tiny body burning against his arm. He called the doctor, paced the nursery, demanded answers. But while he unraveled with fear, Clara was calm. She took Grace into her arms, rocking her gently, singing softly until the baby's cries softened. "You have to stay steady," she told Ethan quietly, her eyes meeting his. "She feels what you feel. If you panic, she'll panic. Let her feel safe." It was then that Ethan realized something profound. Money could buy the best doctors, the best medicine, the best everything. But it could not buy what Clara gave so freely. Peace. And in that dimly lit nursery, as the storm outside mirrored the storm in his heart, Ethan fell in love. Not in the way of sudden passion, but in the way of realization. That this woman, who asked for nothing, had given him everything he hadn't known he needed. Still, Ethan said nothing. How could he? He was a man of wealth, of reputation. She was his employee. To speak his heart would risk everything, the balance of their home, her livelihood, the trust she had built with his daughter, so he kept his silence. Until the night he found her crying. Clara sat alone in the kitchen, her face buried in her hands. On the table lay a letter, worn and creased. He approached slowly, unsure if he had the right to intrude. "Clara?" She startled, wiping at her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." He shook his head. "Don't apologize. What's wrong?" She hesitated, then whispered, "My brother. He's sick. He doesn't have insurance, and the hospital bills are, I don't know how I'll manage it." Ethan's instinct was immediate. He wanted to write a check, make the problem vanish. But he saw the way her hands gripped the edge of the table, as if she feared pity more than poverty. So he didn't offer money. Instead, he offered presents. "Tell me about him," he said softly. And she did. For the first time, Clara spoke about her life, her struggles, her dreams, and Ethan listened, not as a millionaire, but as a man who wanted to understand the woman before him. When she finally met his eyes, she looked surprised to find no judgment there, only care. The turning point came one quiet evening. Grace had fallen asleep early, the house hushed and still. Clara stepped outside to breathe in the night air, her hair loose around her shoulders. She didn't notice Ethan standing by the door, watching her with the same awe he had felt that first night. "You never take anything for yourself," he said at last, his voice low. She turned, startled. "What do you mean? You give and give, my daughter, your brother, everyone. But what about you, Clara? What do you want?" Her breath caught. No one had asked her that in years. For a moment, she couldn't answer. And then, softly, she whispered, "I want to feel like I matter. Not just for what I do, but for who I am." Ethan stepped closer. The weight of his feelings, held back for so long, pressed at his chest. "You do matter," he said, "more than you know." The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with something unspoken, something both fragile and strong. And in that silence, everything changed. From then on, Ethan found himself drawn to her not just as the woman who cared for his child, but as the woman who had unknowingly healed a part of him he thought was beyond repair. He began sharing pieces of himself, stories of his late wife, his fears of failing as a father, his loneliness. Clara listened, not with pity, but with understanding. And slowly, their bond deepened, rooted not in wealth or circumstance, but in humanity. Months later, on a golden morning, Ethan stood at the nursery door once more. Inside, Clara slept on the floor again, Grace nestled in her arms. This time, it wasn't a storm that had brought her there. It was love. A love so pure it required no words, no explanations. Ethan's heart swelled as he watched them. The woman who gave without asking, the child who had taught him to feel again. And he knew. He had built his fortune with contracts and negotiations. But this quiet, unassuming love, was the greatest treasure he had ever found.